In the famous balcony scene of Act 2, Scene 2, Juliet delivers one of the most famous lines in the English language. She says, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet." She then expands on this idea, applying it to Romeo. "So Romeo would, were he not Romeo called, retain that dear perfection which he owes without that title. Romeo, doff thy name, and for thy name, which is no part of thee, take all myself." Juliet here is presenting us with a philosophy of language in these lines. She's making the claim that words are only labels, and those labels are only arbitrarily connected to the things that they represent. A fancy philosopher of language might call this verbal nominalism. And from this philosophical position, she tells Romeo to deny his name, and he, of course, consents. He says, "Call me but love, and I'll be new baptized. My name, dear saint, is hateful to myself because it is an enemy to thee. Had I written, I would tear the word." From there, the two build their own language, their own symbolic system, together on that balcony. A philosopher of language might say that they form their own linguistic community, or that they're playing their own language game outside the broader symbolic order used by the rest of Verona. They want to give themselves labels and throw off the labels that their society has given them. But obviously, they're not fully successful. This is a tragedy. Their private language won't be able to impact their community the same way that the public language will impact them. For this reason, this play has been called a tragedy of naming, or a tragedy of language. We need words to connect with each other, but those words are also restrictive. They will always be insufficient in describing and labeling the objects and concepts that they aspire to describe and label. Romeo and Juliet is a deep exploration of our relationship with language. We need it, but by using it, we put limitations on ourselves. It forces people into categories, and those categories dictate social norms. Juliet needs to marry young because she is Juliet, a woman, and because she is a Capulet. Romeo would be killed in her orchard because he is Romeo, a man, and because he is a Montague. The language that their community applies to their bodies impacts the way that their bodies are treated in the real world. We speak language, sure, but language also speaks us. Words don't just convey meaning, they also produce it. And that's what we're going to try to explain today as we do a close reading of Act 3. If we were being fancy philosophers of language, we might say that we're going to discuss the relationship between the signifier and the signified. But we don't need to be pedantic here. We're just going to discuss how language works in this play. And if this sounds like it's your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. And with that out of the way, let's do some philosophy of language with Act 3 of Romeo and Juliet, play by play. Act 3 begins with Mercutio teasing Benvolio. He's saying that Benvolio is hot-tempered and so on, which is thematically appropriate since Benvolio's name literally means peacemaker, and that's the role that he's played throughout the story so far. Benvolio understands that these accusations and these labels don't apply to him, and so he lets it go. Eventually, Tybalt and Romeo enter the stage, and Tybalt says something very important. He says, "Romeo, the love I bear thee can afford no better term than this. Thou art a villain." He labels Romeo a villain, and Romeo, knowing that these labels don't apply to him, lets it go. He says, "Villain am I none. Therefore farewell. I see thou knowest me not." The label he's been given by Tybalt does not reflect his true self, and so he takes no offense, and he's ready to walk away. But Mercutio isn't. Mercutio escalates the situation, and in the ensuing fight, Tybalt stabs Mercutio underneath Romeo's arm, a fatal blow. And as Mercutio dies, he makes a bunch of jokes, but they're not just any jokes, they're puns. He's playing with language. He says that if we look on him the next day, we will find him a grave man. But he also yells multiple times, "A plague of both your houses." He curses them with his language. Remember, we don't just speak language. Language speaks us. With this curse, Mercutio calls for a tragedy, and that call, as we know, is going to be answered. The death of Mercutio signals a change in genre. Up until this point, the play has been comedic. After his death, it is fully tragic. The first two acts, we had witty banter, beautiful love poetry, bawdy nurses, and so on. After this, we just have a bunch of tears. Mercutio's death bridges the space between comedy and tragedy, just as he stood between the two contradictory forms of masculinity represented by Tybalt, the fighter, and Romeo, the lover, in the previous act. And Mercutio's death inspires Romeo to attack Tybalt himself. He's upset with himself and the person that he's become. Notably, he says, "O sweet Juliet, thy beauty hath made me effeminate." He's saying that Juliet has made him less of a man. When he denied his name on the balcony, he denied all the names that he's been giving, including that of man. And when faced with the death of his friend, he decides to take on all the labels that he's been given, including the label of villain. He says, "Now, Tybalt, take the villain back again, that late thou gavest me." Romeo cannot simply walk away from this label. The label of villain inspires his action. It has become part of him, just like the name Romeo Montague is part of him. Act 2 and the privacy of the balcony scene may have shown us how privately cultivated language between lovers can lead to self-recognition and the creation of an individual free of external influence. Remember Mercutio saying, "Now art thou Romeo"? But in Act 3, we see how publicly used language in the public space of Act 3, Scene 1 can destroy the individual. Romeo stops being Romeo and becomes a villain. He kills Tybalt, fulfilling Tybalt's prophecy. The label Tybalt gave to Romeo created a new Romeo. Words don't just convey meaning, they also produce it. When the prince arrives, he asks Benvolio to recount what has happened. This is the second time that Benvolio has been counted on to serve that purpose. He tells the story faithfully, affirming the ability of language to communicate actual meaning in the world. Though we also have Lady Capulet injecting some fake news about 20 Montagues jumping Tybalt. She's trying to influence public policy, which operates through public language. When the prince banishes Romeo with the words, "We do exile him," those words limit Romeo's ability to move in the world. Language limits behavior. Which brings us to Scene 2. And if Juliet has made Romeo effeminate, then it is clear that Romeo has made Juliet masculine. She opens the scene with a poem articulating her excitement to lose her virginity, an excitement for sexual pleasure typically associated with the men of Verona. She says stuff like, "Learn me to lose a winning match," and "I am sold, not get enjoyed." But more notably for our theme here, she tells the knight to hood my unmanned blood, bathing in my cheeks with thy black mantle. She wants the darkness of night to obscure the fact that she's blushing with anticipation. She wants the night to hide any significations that her body might communicate. She wants pure sexual fantasy, beyond signification, beyond the language that her body wants to use. But she's interrupted by the nurse, who brings the news of Tybalt's death. Except the nurse doesn't say Tybalt's name, she just says, "He's dead," and Juliet suspects that she means Romeo. So apparently Romeo needs the name that she told him to deny in the previous act. When she finally figures out that Romeo has killed Tybalt and that Romeo is banished, she becomes furious with language itself. Beautiful tyrant, fiend angelic, dove-feathered raven, wolvish ravening lamb, despised substance of divinest show. She's yelling a bunch of oxymorons here, similar to the way that Romeo had exclaimed a bunch of oxymorons in Act 1, Scene 1, and the way that this play has depended on oxymorons throughout. These statements show the inability of language to fully capture the human experience. When Juliet realizes that Romeo is still alive, she feels joyful, but finding out that Tybalt has died depresses her. And then finding out that Romeo is exiled complicates it further. There is no name for what Juliet feels at this moment, so she expresses herself in these contradictions because her experience exists beyond our ability to signify it. No words can that woe sound. Language isn't enough, but it's all we've got. Romeo is banished. That's his new label. Romeo is a villain, and Romeo is banished. Banished. Romeo is also husband. These labels all combine to create a complicated situation for Juliet. The nurse agrees to help Romeo sneak in that night so that the two can figure their stuff out together, which takes us to Scene 3, where we see the impact of all of Romeo's new labels on the man himself. And he is a total disaster. Romeo is banished from Verona, the only place that his name means anything. So being banished from Verona is equivalent to being banished from the world. And world's exile is death. Without a social world to recognize him, he might as well be dead. He exists within a network of relationships who know him by certain labels, and when he's removed from that social context, well, he might as well be dead. We need our names, but like our names, the word banished limit our ability to flourish. So what are we to do? Well, collapse on the floor of a friar's cell. That's the only thing that one can do, and that is what Romeo does. When the nurse arrives, we get one of the best examples of how the name Romeo, which the private language of the balcony scene wanted to deny, publicly has a real relationship to the body it signifies. When Romeo hears that Juliet cries his name, he says, "As if that name, shot from the deadly level of a gun, did murder her, as that name's cursed hand murdered her kinsman. Oh, tell me, friar, tell me, in what vile part of this anatomy doth my name lodge? Tell me that I may sack the hateful mansion. Juliet, just a short time earlier, had said, Thou art thyself, though not a Montague. What's a Montague? It is nor hand, nor foot, nor arm, nor face. Oh, be some other name belonging to a man. Juliet denied the relationship of words to the substance of a man, but when Romeo's name appears in public spaces, he cannot escape its relationship to his body. He wants to find where his name lives in his body so that he can cut it out. Their private language was empowering on the balcony, but private language is impotent against public use. In the following scene, Daddy Capulet is no longer the father willing to listen to his daughter and wait for her consent. In Act 1, he told Paris that they'd need to have Juliet's approval, but perhaps that's just because he thought that he would get it. He expected her to approve of the marriage. But now that she has chosen to be something outside of that expectation, Capulet becomes the autocrat. He's going to force her into the mold that Verona has for her. He dictates what kind of relationships can and cannot exist in this city. I think that she will be ruled in all respects by me. Nay, more, I doubt it not. And with that, the timeline of the marriage is moved up to Thursday. She's going to be married in 3 days to Paris. With this news, Paris says, I would that Thursday were tomorrow. In other words, he wishes that desires could change reality, that one can simply change reality by changing the label. Like, what if we just call tomorrow Thursday? This is very similar to Juliet's musings on the balcony when she tells Romeo to give up his name, and it's very similar to what happens in the following scene, the final scene of Act 3. After being just beaten down for a full act, after seeing the full effects that public language and names can have on the bodies that they occupy, Romeo and Juliet finally get the private space of Juliet's bedroom to build themselves back up. Appropriately, this scene begins with them bantering about the name of a bird that they hear singing. Is it a nightingale or a lark? If it's a nightingale, they've got some time. If it's a lark, they do not. The name matters. It doesn't matter if Paris wants tomorrow to be Thursday, just as it doesn't matter that Juliet wants the bird to be a nightingale. The publicly acknowledged names create the world that these individuals live in. You can't transform a lark into a nightingale simply by calling it a nightingale. But they try to use language to shape their reality anyway. Their dialogue in this scene is once again filled with extended metaphors and poetically phrased meditations on the morning. But really, all they're saying is that it's day and that Romeo needs to leave. The way that they use language delays that as long as possible. The nurse eventually interrupts them, and Lady Capulet enters the room. For Lady Capulet, Tybalt's label for Romeo has stuck to him. It's become inscribed on his body. Romeo is a villain. This completes the arc of Act 3. In the first scene, Tybalt labels Romeo a villain, and in the final scene, that label has become part of his public identity. He is a villain, and he is exiled. Words don't just convey meaning, they also produce it. Juliet's language with her mother is filled with double meanings. She, for example, says, "Oh, how my heart abhors to hear him named, and cannot come to him, to wreak the love I bore my cousin upon his body that hath slaughtered him." I mean, she never lies here, but it's also exactly what her mother wants to hear. She's finding a way to use language to express both her private and public self. It does pain her to hear Romeo's name, and she does wish to love the same body that slaughtered her cousin. It's all very clever, and it's also very sad. She can't control the signifiers used against Romeo, but here she can at least play with the ambiguity and insufficiency of language to remain true to herself. Eventually, Daddy Capulet shows up, and when Juliet shows the slightest sign of disobedience, he absolutely loses his mind. He demands, notably, that she speak not, reply not, do not answer me. And with that, Juliet is unable to use language anymore. She cannot define herself anymore. Again, this is not the private language of the mutual self-recognition she helped create on the balcony. She doesn't get to use language in the way that her father does. She doesn't get to create herself. Her father's words will create her in this society. Her inescapable names, Capulet, girl, daughter, they position her within a social hierarchy. Those names and labels give her a destiny that she cannot escape. Again, words don't just convey meaning, they also produce it. When her parents leave Juliet alone, she is left alone with the nurse, and the nurse takes the side of her parents. When a nurse makes that decision, her and Juliet no longer share a language. Juliet becomes cold, and her language here becomes false. Romeo's isolation is physical. He has to leave Verona. Juliet's isolation is social. She has nobody left to talk to. They are both cut off from society. Their true selves can no longer be recognized inside Verona. They have been removed from a social context, and as we know, they're not going to survive. This is a tragedy of names and labels and the way that those names and labels produce the world that individuals have to live in. Act 2 showed us the generative possibilities of mutual self-recognition through private language, and Act 3 showed us the dark realities of social conformity, forged by labels and names that stick to bodies without consent and legal decrees that limit the free movement of the bodies attached to certain names. Juliet's clever wordplay with her mother, however, demonstrates how the ambiguity of language could be leveraged in liberating ways. For a moment, she found the liberating potential of language. She exposed the lingering tension between private thoughts and public language. And that tension between the private and the public is going to be the subject of my next video as we go through Act 4 of Romeo and Juliet play by play. Please subscribe to be notified when that comes out, and thank you for watching.